Ethan marked the last paper in the stack and set his red pen down on the kitchen table. It was a Thursday night, in October, 9:45, and the house smelled like the chicken Scarlett had roasted earlier, herbs and garlic still hanging in the warm air. He stacked the papers into a neat pile, squared the edges twice, and pushed back from the table. Through the window above the sink he could see the light on in his father's house next door. Richard was still up. That was the deal they had worked out. Porch light off meant good night, everything fine. Kitchen light still on at this hour meant his father had found something worth watching on television, or had fallen into one of his books, which happened at least 3 nights out of 7. Ethan watched the light for a moment, then went to the cabinet for a glass of water. Scarlett came downstairs in socked feet, her reading glasses pushed up into her hair. She was carrying her phone and a legal pad covered in handwritten notes, which meant she'd been working a deal from the bedroom. She did that, spread out across the bed with her laptop and her notes and 3 different browsers open, talking through numbers with clients in her easy, unhurried voice that made them feel like nothing was urgent, like they had all the time in the world even when they didn't. "How many?" she said, nodding at the papers. 28. Junior essays on the Great Gatsby. Anyone get it right? 4 of them. She smiled and went to the refrigerator, stood in the cold light of it for a moment, and pulled out the pitcher of water. "Your dad called me this afternoon." "What about?" "He wanted to know if we were coming Sunday. He said he has something planned." Ethan turned. "He said that?" "He said, and I quote, 'Tell Ethan not to make other plans. I have something planned.'" She said it in a low, deliberate voice, doing a fair impression of Richard's particular way of talking, serious even when he wasn't being serious. Ethan laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind that came up fast. "He hates telling you things because you always remember them exactly." "I have an excellent memory." She poured 2 glasses of water and set one in front of him. He sounded good. He did. Better than last month. More energy. Ethan looked at the glass, he picked it up, and drank. His father had had a cardiac event 14 months ago, not a full heart attack. The cardiologist had been careful about that word, but close enough that Ethan had driven 8 hours in a single shot and stood in a hospital corridor at 2 a.m. asking a stranger in scrubs whether his father was going to be all right. He had gotten the call on a Friday. By Monday, he was looking at job listings in Millhaven. By the following spring, he had the teaching position, and by summer, they were packing the apartment in Columbus. Scarlett had not argued. That mattered. Some people would have, plenty of people would have, and he knew it. Millhaven was smaller than anywhere she'd worked before, and the real estate market was modest, and she'd had to rebuild her client list from nothing. She'd done it without making him feel like it was something she had done for him. She just did it, the way she did most things, with her phone and her legal pad and her easy voice that made everything sound manageable. The teaching job paid $11,000 less than his position in Columbus. He had not done the math out loud in front of her. He'd done it in the car on the way to meet with the principal in Millhaven, sitting in the school parking lot with the engine off, and then he'd gone inside and taken the job. His father's house had needed work. Ethan had known that from visits over the years, the porch sagging, the gutters pulling free, the bathroom fixtures that were original to the 1970s and were making their age known. The first summer, he'd done the porch and the gutters and reframed 2 windows that had started to let in cold. The second summer, he'd gutted the upstairs bathroom down to the studs with a buddy from church who knew what he was doing and was patient enough to teach. Ethan had learned to hang drywall that summer. He'd learned to set tile. His hands looked different by August. Richard had tried to pay him. Ethan had declined and kept declining until his father stopped offering and just started making larger dinners on the nights Ethan came over, as if feeding him well was the only currency he could get away with. It was a good life. That was the fair and accurate word for it. Good. Not easy, it had specific costs, and Ethan knew what they were, but good in the way that things you build with your own hands tend to be good. Solid. His. He stood at the kitchen counter with Scarlett, and they talked for another 20 minutes. She told him about the deal she was working, a young couple, first house, completely overwhelmed, the kind of clients she actually liked best because they needed the most guidance and appreciated everything. He told her about a student in his 3rd period class, a junior named Marcus, who had written the one essay in the stack that had genuinely surprised him. A close reading of Fitzgerald's syntax, which was not something a 16-year-old usually cared enough to attempt. "Are you going to tell him that?" Scarlett said. "Tomorrow." "Good. Kids need to hear it." She rinsed her glass and set it in the sink and said she was going up. She kissed him once, clean and quick, the way you kiss someone after 7 years when the kissing has become its own language, not diminished, just fluent. He listened to her sock feet on the stairs. He turned the kitchen light off and checked the back door and went to the front window. His father's light was still on. Ethan stood there for a moment with his arms crossed, watching it through the glass, the way a man watches something he's done the work to protect. The night was clear. A car moved slowly down the street and turned at the corner and was gone. Ethan went upstairs. The bedroom was dark except for the blue light of Scarlett's phone sounding, which she'd set face down on the nightstand, already going still. He undressed quietly and got into bed. She shifted toward him in her sleep, or something close to sleep, and he lay there in the dark, looking at the ceiling. Outside, Richard's kitchen light went off, porch light off, kitchen light off, everything fine. Ethan closed his eyes. Sunday, Richard had something planned. Sunday came in cold and clear, the kind of October morning that made the maples look like they were on fire. Ethan scraped the windshield while Scarlett waited in the passenger seat with the heat running. She'd been ready 20 minutes before he had, which was unusual. Scarlett was the one who lost track of time, who came downstairs still buttoning her jacket. Not today. Today she was sitting with her hands folded in her lap when he came out of the house, a bottle of wine she'd picked up yesterday tucked under her arm. "You could have come out when I started the car," Ethan said, sliding in. "I didn't mind waiting," she said. It was 40 feet to Richard's front door. They walked it. Richard opened before they knocked. He was wearing a clean flannel shirt, dark blue, the kind he reserved for church and holidays. He'd shaved. There was something on the stove that smelled like garlic and rosemary, and the dining room table had been set with the good dishes, the cream-colored ones with the thin gold rim that had lived in the cabinet above the refrigerator for as long as Ethan could remember. "You shaved," Ethan said. "Man's allowed to shave." Scarlett handed him the wine, and Richard looked at the label and nodded like he already knew what it was going to be. "Come in," he said. It's almost ready." The table was set for 3, but arranged differently than usual. Richard always put himself at the head, Ethan to his left, Scarlett across from Ethan. Today the head chair was empty and the 2 side settings were angled slightly inward, the way you'd arrange seating when you wanted to face your guests. Ethan registered it and moved to the seat he always took. Scarlett paused for just a half second before taking hers. Richard went back to the kitchen. "Nice," Scarlett said, looking at the table. "He must have ironed that cloth," Ethan said. "I haven't seen it out since Easter." She nodded, glancing toward the kitchen doorway. Dinner was roast chicken with root vegetables, a green salad, the bottle of wine Scarlett had brought. Richard carved at the counter and brought the plate out already arranged. He cooked well, always had, but there was a carefulness to tonight's food that was different from his usual. The vegetables had been cut uniform. The salad had 2 kinds of lettuce. "Dad," Ethan said, "what's the occasion? Can I make dinner? You made dinner last month and served it out of the pot." Richard sat down and unfolded his napkin. "I wanted a nice meal. That a problem?" It wasn't a problem. Ethan let it go. The conversation moved through easy territory, school, Richard's most recent cardiology appointment, which had gone well, a tree service that had taken down the dead elm at the corner of their block that week. Ethan talked about Marcus, the junior who'd written something worth reading. Richard asked good questions the way he always did. Scarlett was quieter than usual, but she was eating, and she refilled Richard's glass when it got low. It was when she reached across to pour that Ethan noticed the bracelet. Silver, delicate, a thin chain with a small oval charm that caught the candlelight. He'd never seen it before. Scarlett wasn't a jewelry person. She wore her wedding ring and a pair of small gold studs she'd owned since college, and that was it. She'd told him once that jewelry felt like clutter on her hands when she was working. "Is that new?" Ethan asked. Scarlett glanced at her wrist. "This? No, I've had it. I don't think I've seen it. I just don't wear it much." She set the bottle down and picked up her fork. Richard reached for the bread. Ethan didn't push it. He thought, vaguely, that it might have been something she'd gotten at one of the open houses. Realtors sometimes traded things, gift baskets, bottles, the occasional trinket. Or maybe it was from the young couple she'd helped close the deal last week. People gave gifts when they got their keys. He thought this and moved on. The meal finished slowly. Richard brought out a store-bought pie he'd warmed in the oven, apple with 2 small scoops of vanilla ice cream that had partially melted by the time they hit the table. Ethan ate both scoops. Richard walked them out just before 7. The porch light threw a pale yellow square onto the front steps. Ethan went down first and turned up his collar against the cold. Behind him, he heard Scarlett say something low to Richard. He didn't catch it, and heard Richard say, "I know. Not, okay, not sure, just, I know." Quiet and certain, the way you'd answer someone who hadn't asked a question so much as said something that required acknowledging. Ethan was already on the walk. He waited, and Scarlett came down the steps and fell in beside him. "Good dinner," she said. "Yeah," he said. He went all out. He looked back once. Richard was still standing in the doorway, one hand on the frame, watching them cross the yard. He raised the other hand when Ethan looked, a small wave, fingers only, and then stepped back inside and closed the door. The porch light stayed on. Ethan noticed that too, in a minor way. Richard always killed the porch light when they left. It was the kind of thing Ethan had watched for through the kitchen window on weeknights. Porch light off, kitchen light off. Everything fine. Tonight it stayed on. Ethan told himself his father had probably just forgotten. He was 62 and tired after cooking a real meal, and it was cold, and the switch was inside. He didn't mention it. They went home. The call came on a Wednesday at 12:47 in the afternoon. Ethan was eating lunch at his desk in room 114, the door shut against the hallway noise, a container of leftover soup going cold beside his keyboard. He'd been rereading Marcus's essay for the 3rd time, making notes in the margin about syntax, about the particular way the kid understood longing without being able to name it. His phone lit up on the desk. He didn't recognize the number, but the area code was local, and he answered. "Ethan." A woman's voice. "Careful. It's Diane." He set down his pen. Diane was his father's younger sister. She lived in the White House directly across the street from Richard's, the one with the covered porch and the wind chime she'd had since before Ethan was born. She and Richard had a comfortable, low-key relationship, holiday calls, the occasional dinner. She was not someone who phoned without a reason. "Hey, Diane," a pause that went on 2 seconds too long. "I've been trying to decide whether to call you for about 6 weeks, she said. "I need you to know that." Ethan pushed the soup container to the side of the desk. "Okay. Scarlett's car has been in your father's driveway every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon since at least the beginning of September." She stopped. "I know what day you get home from school. I know the car is always gone before that." The room didn't change. The hum of the ventilation system continued. Somewhere down the hall, a locker closed. "How many times?" Ethan said. "I stopped counting at 12. Another pause. "I'm sorry. I didn't want to be the person making this call." "I know," he said. He thanked her. He ended the call. He sat for a moment looking at the essay on his desk, at Marcus's clean, careful handwriting, at the sentence he'd underlined 3 times that the light was always across the water, always almost close enough. He put the phone face down. He did not stand up. He drove home at his regular time, parked in his regular spot, and went inside. Scarlett was in the kitchen making pasta, her back to the door. She asked how his day was without turning around. He said fine. He went upstairs, changed out of his work clothes, came back down. They ate at the kitchen table. She talked about a showing she'd done that afternoon, a split level in the north part of town with original hardwood floors and a problematic basement. He listened. He asked one question about the basement. She answered it. They cleared the plates. He did not sleep. See, by Thursday morning he'd made one decision. He needed to see it himself. Not to be certain, Diane's voice had already closed that door, and the Tuesday and Thursday schedule mapped too cleanly against the silver bracelet, against Richard's pressed flannel shirt, against the porch light that had stayed on. He was already certain. What he needed was something he could hold in his hands when the time came, something that didn't depend on his own testimony, At 6:15 in the morning, he drove to the hardware store on Clement Street when it opened and bought a trail camera, the kind people mounted on fence posts to monitor deer. Small, weatherproof, motion-activated. He paid cash. He mounted it in the oak tree at the corner of Richard's front yard that same morning, before Richard was awake, the camera facing the driveway at an angle that caught the front door and the steps. He'd climbed that tree when he was 11 years old. He knew exactly which branch would hold him. He went to school. He taught 4 classes. He did not check his phone during passing periods the way he sometimes did. So a ring. Thursday afternoon, 4:08 p.m. He was sitting in his car in the school parking lot, engine off. He'd told himself he would wait until he got home, but he hadn't moved to start the car. He opened the trail cameras app and pulled up the motion-activated clips from the afternoon. The first clip was 2:31 p.m. Scarlett's white Civic pulling into the driveway. She got out carrying a canvas grocery bag. She didn't look around. She walked straight to the front door like someone arriving home. The second clip was 2:34, the door opening from the inside before she knocked. Richard in the doorway. The third clip was the one. It was 4:02 p.m., the front door opening again. Both of them in the frame, Scarlett a half step ahead, Richard behind her with one hand on the small of her back, not guiding her, not a casual touch, but the kind of settled, proprietary placement that doesn't happen accidentally. She turned on the top step. She turned back toward him, and Richard brought his hand up and touched the side of her face, his thumb tracing along her cheekbone, and she leaned into it. He kissed her once, unhurried, the way people do when they have been doing it for a long time and have stopped worrying about being caught. Her hand came up and pressed flat against his chest. He kept his forehead against hers for a moment after. She stepped back. He watched her walk to the car. She didn't look at the street, didn't look at Diane's white house across the road, didn't look anywhere but at her keys. Richard stood in the doorway until the Civic backed out. He raised one hand, small like a goodbye from a man with a right to give one. Ethan watched the clip twice. Then he set the phone on the passenger seat, screen down. Outside, a group of students crossed the parking lot. One of them laughed at something, a clean, bright sound in the cold air. A minivan pulled out of the pickup line. Everything continued at its regular speed. He'd taught the Sunday dinner, the pressed flannel shirt, the gold-rimmed dishes, the roast chicken with its uniform-cut vegetables. "I know," Richard had said, in the dark of the porch. Not, "I know what you mean," or "I know it's getting cold." Just, "I know," the way a man answers a sentence he's been expecting. He put both hands on the steering wheel. He stared at the dashboard. Scarlett would be home in 40 minutes. She would come in carrying the canvas bag. She would put something in the refrigerator. She would ask about his day. She had been doing this every Tuesday and Thursday for at least 6 weeks, probably longer, and then coming home and asking about his day. Richard had repaired Ethan's first bicycle when the chain broke. Richard had sat in the second row at their wedding because the front row was for immediate family, and he'd argued, without irony, that he didn't want to make Scarlett's people uncomfortable by sitting too close to the front. Richard had made him roast chicken on Sunday night and carved it at the counter with his back turned. Ethan started the car. He pulled out of the parking lot and drove home at exactly the speed he always drove, and when he got there, he went inside and started the kettle for tea, and when Scarlett's car pulled into the driveway, he was standing at the kitchen window with his hands wrapped around a mug that he had not yet lifted to his mouth. She came in through the back door. She set the canvas bag on the counter. She looked at him and smiled. "Traffic was rough," she said. "Yeah," he said. She started unpacking the bag. He watched her hands move over the counter, arranging things. He took a sip of the tea. He knew exactly what he was going to do. He hadn't worked out every detail yet, but the core of it was already fixed and solid and entirely calm, the way a weight settles when it reaches the bottom. Scarlett hadn't looked at the trail camera in the oak tree. Neither had Richard. They didn't know it was there. They didn't know he knew. That gap, that precise, invisible distance between what they believed and what was true belonged to him now, and he intended to keep it until he was ready to use it. Ethan sat in the school parking lot until the windows fogged. He did not start the car. He watched the trail camera clip a third time, then a fourth, and somewhere in there he stopped watching it as evidence and started watching it as a fact he already lived inside. His father's thumb along Scarlett's cheekbone, her hand flat on his chest, the way she leaned, the way she always leaned into the man who raised him. He turned the phone face down and set both hands on the wheel. The decision came without ceremony. It did not announce itself. It arrived the way the cold arrives in October, a degree at a time, until you realize you can see your breath. He would not scream. He would not drive the 40 feet between the two houses and pound on the blue door and demand the thing they would only lie about anyway. He had watched his father lie at a dinner table 4 days ago in a pressed flannel shirt. He had watched Scarlett claim a bracelet she'd never owned. They were good at it. They had been good at it for months, in the afternoons while he taught teenagers about a man who built his whole life on a lie and called it love. He would take the one thing they could not lie their way around. He would take the people, not loudly, not in a scene. He would simply let the world that loved his father see what he had seen, and then he would step back and watch that world rearrange itself in the dark, the way a tide goes out without asking anyone's permission. He started the car. His hands were steady. That surprised him more than anything. Diane lived 20 minutes north, in a brick ranch with a wreath she changed every season. She had the porch light on when he pulled in, which meant she'd been watching the road. She opened the door before he knocked. "You look terrible," she said. "I need you to see something." She made coffee neither of them drank. He set the phone on her kitchen table and pressed play and turned it so she could see. And he watched her face instead of the screen because he already knew the screen by heart. He watched his aunt's mouth go flat. He watched her bring 2 fingers up to it. He watched her not look away, which was the thing he loved about Diane, that she did not flinch from a hard thing once it was in front of her. The clip ended. She sat with her hands in her lap. "That's my brother," she said. "Yes." "With your wife?" "Yes." Diane stood and went to the sink and put both hands on the edge of it and looked out the window at nothing. The silence ran long. A clock ticked somewhere behind him. "What do you want me to do?" she finally said. "Not, what are you going to do for what? What did he want from her?" He understood then that he had chosen the right person first. "Nothing tonight," he said. "I want you to know it before anyone else does, before he can get to you with a story." She turned around. "He won't get to me." "He's good," Ethan said. "You know how good he is. He'll have a version. He'll call you and he'll have a version where it's complicated, where it just happened, where nobody meant anything by it." His voice did not rise. He kept it level on purpose because the moment he let it move, he was not sure where it would go. "I needed you to see the thumb on her face before you heard his voice. That's all. I needed you to see it first." Diane looked at the phone, face down now on her table. "I've seen it," she said. He did not tell the whole town. That was never the shape of it. He told no one to gather. He sent no message to a group. He simply stopped. He stopped answering when Richard called on Friday. The phone buzzed on the kitchen counter and lit up with the word Dad, and Ethan stood 3 feet from it and let it ring out. It rang again 20 minutes later. He let it ring out again. He had answered that man's calls his entire life. He had driven across 2 states 14 months ago because that man's heart had stuttered in his chest, and he had moved his marriage and his salary and his whole life into the house next door so the calls would never go unanswered. Now he stood and let it ring, and the not answering was the loudest thing he had ever done. Sunday came. They did not go. Scarlett came down at noon in her socked feet and stood in the kitchen doorway and watched him grade papers at the table. "Are we not going over?" she said. "No." "Did something happen?" He looked up at her. He let the look last. He watched her hold it, charming and bright and steady, the same face that had said, "I've had it forever. I just never wear it." And he understood that she would lie to him directly, to his eyes, on a Sunday and feel nothing. "I have a lot of grading," he said, and went back to the papers. She stood there a moment longer. Then she went back upstairs. He heard the bedroom door close, soft, and he heard faintly the sound of her making a call she did not want him to hear. The cracks did not start with him. They started around his father, in the small rooms where Richard had spent 20 years being a good man. Diane did not make speeches. She had spent 58 years learning how a thing moves through a place like Millhaven, and she let it move. She mentioned it to the two women she'd known since the Methodist youth group in a kitchen over a casserole dish being returned. She mentioned it because they would have heard the why anyway, the why Ethan stopped coming, and she would not let the why be Richard's version. She told it plainly once, and then she let those two women carry it the way truth carries in a small town, hand to hand, kitchen to kitchen, until it reached the people who sat next to Richard on Sunday and the men who'd thrown a ball down a lane beside him every Tuesday night for 15 years. Richard felt it before he understood it. He felt it at the 10:30 service when he slid into his pew and the Hendersons, who had saved him a seat every week since his wife left, had their coats stacked on the space beside them. He felt it in the parking lot after, when Carl Foster, who had pulled him out of a burning duplex in 1991, saw him coming and got very busy with his keys and was in his truck before Richard crossed the lot. He felt it Tuesday night at the Lanes, when he sat down at the scoring table and the conversation that had been running did not pick back up, and three men he'd known for 15 years found things to look at that were not him. He went home and called Ethan. It rang out. He called again. It rang out. He stood in the kitchen where he had taught his son to fix a leaking trap under the sink, and he looked through the window at the lit windows of his son's house 40 feet away, and he called a third time. And Ethan, standing at his own sink looking back, watched the phone light up and did not move. It almost broke once. It almost closed back around him, and Ethan had known it would, and he had known exactly where. His cousin Paul called on a Wednesday, Diane's son, the one who'd idolized Richard the way Ethan had. Paul's voice was tight. "I'm hearing things," Paul said, "about Uncle Rich, about Scarlett." "You're hearing right. He says it's not what people are turning it into." Paul's words came fast now, defensive, a man clutching at the shape of someone he loved. "He called me. He's a mess, Ethan. He's saying everybody's decided he's a monster off a rumor, that nobody's even asked him, that you won't even talk to him. And I gotta say, man, that's your dad. After everything he's been through, maybe this is private, maybe this doesn't belong getting spread all over the church, maybe people are overreacting and a good man's getting buried for it. There it was, the fabric pulling tight, trying to close." Paul, who would have stood in front of Richard and held the line, who had the standing to make the family doubt, who could turn the truth back into a rumor with one good speech at one dinner. Ethan did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He had already lost the version of his life where arguing would have helped. "Paul," he said, "check your messages, the ones from me, last Thursday, 6:11 p.m. Silence on the line. He had sent it the night he showed Diane. He had not told Paul to watch it. He had simply sent the clip, no words, to the one man in the family most likely to wobble, and let it sit there unopened, because he had known for certain, the way you know your own cousin, that Paul would not look until he needed to, and that when he needed to, it would already be there, time-stamped, undeniable, waiting. Ethan heard the phone shift against Paul's ear. He heard a video start to play, tinny and small. He heard his father's recorded voice, soft, saying something to Scarlett on a porch in the afternoon light. He heard it cut off. The silence after went on for a long time. "Oh," Paul said. The fight had gone out of him entirely. His voice cracked on the single syllable. "Oh, no. No, Ethan, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. He made it sound... I know what he made it sound like," Ethan said. "He's good at it. That's why I sent it before he called you." Paul was crying now, quietly, an adult man undone in his car. I was about to defend him at Mom's on Sunday. I had it all worked out in my head." "I know you were," Ethan said. "That's why I sent it to you first. He hung up gently. He set the phone on the counter. His own hands, he noticed, were not steady anymore. He had built the thing to hold, and it had held, and the holding cost him something he could not name. He sat down at the kitchen table and put his face in his hands for exactly 1 minute, and then he took them away and went back to his grading, because the papers were due back Monday, and the work, at least, still made sense. The collapse came to Richard the way the cold had come to Ethan. A degree at a time, until he could see his own breath in a warm room. He understood it fully on a Tuesday evening, alone in his kitchen, with a phone that had stopped lighting up. He'd been telling himself a story. Ethan could see it from 40 feet away in the slump that had come into his father's shoulders that month. The story was, "They don't know the whole of it, and when they hear my side, it will soften. It always softens. People are decent, and they will let an old man explain." He had carried that story to church and to the lanes and to his own family, and he had watched it die in their faces one room at a time, and still he had held a corner of it because the alternative was unsurvivable. The alternative arrived when he called the Hendersons to ask why they hadn't saved his seat, and Marie Henderson, who had brought him soup the week his heart stuttered, said, "I think it's best you find another pew, Richard," and hung up before he could build the version. It arrived when Carl Foster, Carl who owed him nothing because Richard had owed Carl his life since 1991, the debt running the other way, did not pick up the first call, or the second, or the third, and then turned the phone off entirely because some men cannot bear to refuse a friend out loud and can only do it in silence. It arrived, finally, when Richard understood the timeline, when he sat at his table with the cream-colored dishes back in the cabinet above the refrigerator and did the arithmetic and felt it land in his chest worse than the cardiac event ever had. They had known, first, every one of them, the warmth of the last weeks, the nod from the choir director, the wave from the man 2 houses down, the casual hello at the hardware store. None of it had been the warmth of people who didn't know. It had been the careful, terrible politeness of people deciding how to leave him. The laughter at the lanes, the seat that was still his, the casserole someone left on his porch, all of it had been a long goodbye he had been too proud to recognize as a goodbye. He had been waving back at people who were already gone. He had thought he still had a community. He had been the last man in town to learn he had lost it, and he had lost it to the one person who had built it for him in the first place. His son had built that life back for him after retirement, driven him to the lanes the first month so he wouldn't go alone, sat with him in the church basement until the men there pulled a chair up and made him one of them, patched the porch and the gutters and the upstairs bathroom and refused the money and got bigger dinners instead. His son had stitched a whole world around a lonely widower, thread by thread, and now his son had simply stopped, and the world had come apart along the seams the sun had sewn because there was nothing holding it together but the sun. Richard called Ethan one more time, that Tuesday night. It was the last call he would make for a long while, and he must have known it because he let it ring longer than the others. 8 rings, 9, as if the ringing itself were a kind of company. Ethan stood at his sink with the water running over a plate he had already washed. He looked across the dark yard at his father's kitchen window, lit up, and he could see the shape of the old man standing in it, phone to his ear, waiting. He could see Richard turn slightly, scanning the dark for the answering light in his son's house, the way he had scanned it for 35 years, certain the boy would always be there to pick up. Ethan turned off the water. He turned off the kitchen light, and he stood in the dark of his own house and watched his father stand in the light of his holding a phone to his ear that no one would ever answer again. And he did not move, and he did not weep, and the not moving was the whole of what he had to say. The phone in his pocket went still. The call had ended. Across the yard, after a long moment, Richard lowered his arm. He stood there a while longer in his bright kitchen, a man understanding, completely and alone, that the silence was permanent and that he had built it himself. One Tuesday afternoon at a time, every week since September, with a woman who had leaned into him on a porch and pressed her hand flat against his chest. Then Richard's kitchen light went off. Ethan stood in his own dark a while longer. Upstairs, Scarlett's footsteps crossed the bedroom and stopped. She did not know yet how much was gone. She would, soon. He had not decided the shape of that part yet, only that it would come, and that it would be quiet, and that she would have no version of it she could lie her way out of because by the time she understood, everyone she would have called had already heard. For now, he stood at the cold window and looked at the dark square where his father's light had been. Porch light off, kitchen light off. Everything fine, he thought, and the thought did not comfort him at all, and he let it not comfort him, and he stayed at the window in the dark a long time after there was nothing left to see. Ethan filed the divorce papers on a Tuesday, 11 days after he watched his father's kitchen light go off for the last time. He drove to the county clerk's office alone, parked in the small lot off Main, and carried the folder inside. The woman behind the counter stamped the documents without looking up. He thanked her. She said, "Have a good day." Scarlett had moved out the previous Friday. She'd taken 2 carloads to a rental on the east side of town, one trip Thursday evening and one early Friday before he was awake. He came downstairs at 6:15 to find her gone and a single coffee cup left in the drying rack. She had not taken the photograph from the hallway wall, the 2 of them on the Maine coast, her hair sideways in the wind. He left it up for 3 days without deciding anything, then took it down and put it in the spare room, face down on the floor. He ate standing at the kitchen counter that first Saturday. Scrambled eggs he'd made in the small pan, a piece of toast, a glass of orange juice. Outside the window, Richard's house was visible across the yard. The kitchen light was off. It was 9 a.m. Ethan ate his eggs and didn't look away from the window, not because there was anything to see, but because he wasn't afraid of the view anymore. Paul had stopped calling. That was the whole of what needed to be said about that. Richard's name had not come up at school, not once. Ethan's students turned in their next unit essays on Monday morning, and by Tuesday he'd marked 12 of them. Marcus had written something strange and controlled about the use of color in Fitzgerald. Not green, not gold, but the gray of the Valley of Ashes, and Ethan wrote a single sentence in the margin. This is the right question. He put the essay on top of the stack. Wednesday he went to the hardware store on Clement. He bought 2 hooks for the mudroom wall and a small level, paid cash, and drove home. He spent 20 minutes getting the first hook straight before the level showed true. The second hook went faster. He hung his coat on one and left the other empty. He stepped back and looked at them and felt something he couldn't name and didn't try to. The bracelet was still on the bathroom shelf. Scarlett had left it, the delicate chain, the small oval charm. He found it Thursday morning when he was shaving. He picked it up and set it in the small dish by the sink where she used to keep it. It stayed there another 4 days before he put it in the spare room with the photograph. Not thrown away, just no longer in the place where it could catch the light. Ethan went to the grocery store that Saturday, a long one, produce, coffee, 2 pounds of pasta, chicken thighs, a jar of good olive oil he didn't usually buy. He walked the aisles without a list. He chose the chicken thighs because they were there, because he was hungry, because the rest of his life was still going to include dinner. At the checkout, the woman ahead of him was arguing gently with the cashier about a coupon, and Ethan waited with his cart and looked out the wide front windows at the parking lot and the trees at the edge of it, dropping their last leaves in the wind. He was not in any hurry. That evening, he roasted the chicken with the good olive oil, salt, some rosemary from a bunch he'd bought on impulse. The smell filled the kitchen, and he stood at the stove with a glass of wine and listened to the house. It was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet than it had been. Something that had been held tight in his chest had loosened, not all at once, not cleanly, but enough. He did not think about his father's hand on the small of Scarlett's back. He thought about it for a second, and then it passed through him, and he turned the chicken in the pan. Richard had not called in 9 days. Ethan knew, through nothing he'd gone looking for, that Carl Foster had stopped bowling Thursday nights and wasn't planning to start again. That was one line in a conversation Diane had not tried to protect him from. He hadn't asked her to. He let it settle, and he didn't build anything on top of it. He ate the chicken at the table with the overhead light on. He refilled his glass. He did not turn on the television. After dinner, he washed the pan at the sink. Through the window above it, Richard's house stood in the dark. One light was on. The living room, a warm yellow square. Ethan dried the pan with a dish towel and hung it on the hook above the stove. He did not watch the window for the light to change. He opened the back door and stood in the doorway for a minute. The night air came through cold and clean, the way October air in Millhaven always came. He could hear leaves moving in the oak tree at the corner of the yard, the same tree where he'd mounted the camera, the same tree he'd climbed at 11, and nothing else. He breathed it in. He stood there until he was cold, and then he went inside. and he closed the door.
If you made it this far, you already know why this channel exists. See you tomorrow.